I am Gerri Ratliff, the Acting Director of the Community Relations Service. And I'm proud to say that CRS is one of the alternatives to prosecution we're here to talk about today. Through our services of supporting communities who are working to prevent and respond to hate crimes and bias through mediation, facilitated dialogue, consultation, and training. We were created under Title 10 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And our jurisdiction was broadened in 2009 through the enactment of, as we've heard about earlier today, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. We respond to community conflicts by supporting those communities as they work to reduce tensions and respond to bias and hate crimes arising from differences of race, color, national origin, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, or disability. We don't have investigative or prosecutorial authority. Instead, we work impartially with communities to help rebuild relationships, facilitate mutual understanding, and importantly, encourage the development of local solutions. Through our 14 regional and field offices across the country, we offer voluntary, free, and confidential services for our communities. So now turning to our panel members, our panelists have dedicated their careers to confronting hate and working for justice, each also in contexts involving alternatives to prosecution. First, Seema Gajwani is Special Counsel for Juvenile Justice Reform and Chief of the Restorative Justice Program section at the DC Office of the Attorney General. Prior to this position, she ran the Criminal Justice Program at the Public Welfare Foundation in DC, funding efforts to improve criminal and juvenile justice systems across the country, with a focus on pretrial detention reform and prosecutorial culture change. Seema started her career as a trial attorney with the DC Public Defender Service, representing juvenile and adult defendants. And in 2019, Seema was selected to be an Obama Foundation Fellow for her work on restorative justice. Next, Sumayyah Waheed is the Senior Policy Counsel at the National Civil Rights Organization Muslim Advocates, which litigates, educates, and advocates in support of the equal treatment under the law for all Americans. She is a policy expert with over 15 years of experience in legal and policy advocacy at the state, local, and national levels. Sumayyah led statewide juvenile and criminal justice campaigns at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland, California, playing a key role in the movement to dismantle the state's youth prison system. She has also worked for Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. And then our third panel member is David Dinielli. David is a visiting clinical lecturer in law at Yale Law School. He is also a senior policy fellow at Yale's Tobin Center for Economic Policy, where his work centers on developing antitrust and competition frameworks to address economic and societal harms of concentrated power in digital markets. He previously was senior advisor to the Responsible Technology Group at Omidra Network, and also served for nearly 7 years as Deputy Legal Director at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he oversaw the center's anti-hate and extremism litigation, as well as its LGBTQ rights work. So, all right, panel members, we're going to get started. Each of your there's some overlap, but different professions falls into a slightly different model of alternatives to the prosecution of hate and other crimes, and is very different in most ways from my own office, CRS's model of using facilitated dialogue to increase understanding and build community level capacity for local problem solving. So Sumayyah, we'll start with you. Muslim Advocates tracks hate incidents and advocates for the enactment of stronger hate crime laws, as well as advocating for the vigorous investigation and prosecution of hate crimes. So 2 questions for you. 1, what role do these alternative approaches play in the larger fight against hate? And then in what situations are these tools most effective?
Thank you, Gerri, and thank you to the DOJ for having this panel and for including us in it. That's a great question. Alternatives are a critical piece of a holistic and comprehensive societal effort to eradicate hate and systemic racism and prejudice. So we know that one person's hate is just an expression of a systemic problem that goes much deeper. And when we're trying to address those individual acts, we always have to remember the root cause and come back to that when we think about our responses. Importantly, the vast majority of hate that communities who are marginalized experience does not end up in the criminal legal system. So, and we know, I think somebody mentioned that the FBI hate crime statistics are notoriously underreported. I'm going to give an example of some data from the American Muslim community to illustrate this point. A recent survey from the Othering and Belonging Institute on Islamophobia through the eyes of Muslims reported that American Muslims, 2/3 of American Muslims experience Islamophobia, so anti-Muslim hate, but 88% do not report. 88%. And so why is that? So for one part of it, not every incident, not every act of hate is a crime. So you can experience somebody yelling a slur at you and without a threat of physical violence or property damage, et cetera. That's not actually a crime. And then even if there is a crime that occurs, it might not be considered serious enough for the police to spend resources on it. You may not feel like law enforcement is going to take it seriously. And so that is one role that Muslim advocates will play, is that if there is an act of hate and it is a crime and law enforcement is not taking it seriously, we will step in to help ensure that they are responsive to the community's concerns. But again, just a small sliver of what occurs ends up in the system. And then another dynamic at play, which was actually mentioned in the previous remarks, is the mistrust of law enforcement. So our communities have already been over-policed and over-surveilled for decades, particularly Black Muslims, but especially in the aftermath of the war on terror, where federal law enforcement enshrined anti-Muslim bias in its policies, which criminalized our religious and political expression. That engendered a lot of mistrust for law enforcement and for the fear that there might be informants in our wake, and not wanting to increase that presence will discourage community members from going to law enforcement. So these are issues that we're not the only community that has these issues. And so they're another piece of the conversation that we have to have in looking at what our response should be to hate and how are we actually going to get ahead of it so that these acts don't occur and we don't have continued tragedies. So I think the second part of the question is actually really broad, and some of the previous speakers talked about the education that needs to happen, the real like nitty-gritty community work of building and fostering healthy relationships among different communities, but also for people with platforms, whether they're political or in social media or otherwise, to really stand up to hate speech when it does occur. We know that when the former President Trump was running for election, his hate speech resulted in real, actual increases in hate crimes. So it's up to other folks with platforms to call this out and work against anyone who's trying to embolden people who might be white supremacists, et cetera, who will then organize and actually commit acts of hate. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's always been work to be done in the history of our country, but we're in the aftermath of, and in the midst of a real spike in white supremacy and violence. Here in my own state of Washington and in the Seattle area, we've had 3 or 4 incidents in the past month that definitely raised concerns. And while we're going to law enforcement for investigation and for consequences, we also know that we need to do the work within the community to ensure that this doesn't keep happening.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are such important points. And David, your career has really touched both advocacy and civil litigation. So I'm wondering if you have anything to add to what Sumayyah was talking about in terms of the advocacy side, but also I want to make sure we hear about your thoughts about when is litigation most effective. So if you could start with advocacy and then maybe talk a little bit about when you were at the SBLC, how did you decide which strategy would be most effective?
Sure, and I will say that I don't necessarily make the distinction between advocacy and litigation as separate activities, but rather they happen all at the same time, because oftentimes these hate incidents are not simply an event that then lawyers look at and decide whether there's a cause of action that can be brought in a particular court. They're events that affect entire communities in multiple ways, and the effective case necessarily oftentimes depends upon effective advocacy in terms of mobilizing a community in support of the litigation. I will say on the advocacy side, picking up some of the points that already have been made, hate incidents for individuals in particular can be very, not just traumatizing as we all would think of that word to mean, but also very confusing. Oftentimes they seem to happen out of the blue to people who don't know as much about the way the world works as those of us who have either been active in resisting hate or studied it know. We found that oftentimes with respect to the most important response to an individual, that simply literally showing up with information, explaining who the people are that we think have perpetrated the act, where they fit into some sort of broader ideology, giving them factual information about the continuation of threats and doing what you can to arm them, to return to them some sort of agency. So that is the kind of thing that would happen whether you were planning a lawsuit or not. Similarly, I think of the other half of initial advocacy as helping the broader community and nation or world understand the context in which a particular act has happened. And the advocacy groups that are represented here today all are specialists at that. When, for example, there is a shooting at a Black church in South Carolina, it's important not just to know the numbers of people who were either killed or injured or the name of the person who committed the act, but to contextualize that so people understand what that might be a part of, what it might reflect, and then also what are the specific causes of the incident. So again, this is the kind of education that occurs regardless of whether a lawsuit is brought. Maybe I could talk a little bit about how we would make decisions about when to bring litigation and what those benefits might be. This is not illustrative of how everyone makes decisions, but strategic litigation is different than, for example, prosecution of a crime, in that oftentimes those of us who are involved in trying to make the world different or better in some way or another have in our heads or our strategic plans the kinds of cases we would like to bring to make particular changes. One of the cases that I might have some time to talk about today is that kind of a case. The Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, was documenting and was concerned about the rise of acts of hate that were perpetrated entirely online. And so there was no physical violence, there was no property damage, there was no cross that was burning in front of someone's house, but instead something that one of the speakers today will talk about in terms of her own experience, something called a troll storm, where there's an organized effort to bring in the power of the masses to target a particular individual to make that person's life unlivable. That had been a concern, something we've been watching. And as those of us who do strategic litigation know, you sometimes wait for the right set of facts, you wait for the right plaintiff, you wait for the right jurisdiction, perhaps. And that's the kind of thing that is behind, I think, all of our advocacy efforts. We try to marry the two such that the litigation is not something that arises out of whole cloth or just because something happened, but that is integral to the larger advocacy framework and efforts, because the goal is to change the world, not to get a particular judgment for a particular person.
So I'm wondering if you're referring to, or if you'd like to tell us about a case that many of us are probably already a little bit familiar with, about the Daily Stormer case, and it just had such an amazing outcome. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about it, its outcome, and then just in that particular instance, how did SBLC decide that litigation was the right approach in that instance?
Sure. And I'll try to do this without necessarily divulging work product or attorney-client communications. But back to the model of advocacy and litigation combined, where you use the litigation either to make a particular point or to put some pressure where changes need to be made to the positive law. Again, the issue here was the rise of exclusively online hate. An event happened in a town called Whitefish, Montana, which is an idyllic ski resort in the Northern Rockies. It also is the place where Richard Spencer, a well-known white nationalist, has, along with his family, had a vacation home for a long time. Our client is a real estate agent, still there, Whitefish, Montana, who was improperly and inaccurately targeted by Richard Spencer as having tried to extort Richard Spencer's mother in connection with a real estate deal. This related to incidents after the 2016 election in which Richard Spencer was videotaped in a tape that made it around the world, speaking to his followers, and the result was a sig heil in response. This raised tensions in the town, and I'm not going to get into all of the details, but bottom line, event, my client wrongly targeted by Richard Spencer, which then was picked up by someone named Andrew Anglin, who's the publisher of the Daily Stormer, which at the time was the most visited hate site on the web. It had over 400,000 unique visitors, and it took its name from a Nazi paper called Der Stürmer. It was horribly anti-Semitic, but also every piece of content in it was offensive to some group or another, whether that be Muslims, whether that be African Americans, whether that be pick your group. It was not welcome at the Daily Stormer. Andrew Anglin then called upon his readers to launch one of these troll storms directed at my client. And one day she started receiving phone calls. Her office started receiving phone calls. Her husband started receiving phone calls. Their social media was flooded. Her then 12-year-old son's social media was flooded with things like images of ovens, exhortations that he should go look in the oven for his Xbox, pictures of his face on the photoshopped onto the gates of Auschwitz. Again, this was a coordinated effort to make her life unlivable, in part by the involvement of her family and her business and her young son in particular. We immediately sort of showed up is what we did, and we investigated. But the initial kind of benefit, I think, to the community was that we were there. We could tell people who this person was, what this tactic was, and help them understand what was happening. But this was a good case to think about in terms of litigation because the facts were extreme. Our client was very severely affected by what was happening. And the kinds of messages that were being targeted, that were being sent to her, seemed to be a good way to test the question whether this kind of conduct is protected by the First Amendment. We had a goal of trying to establish the fact that these kinds of coordinated actions are not protected by the First Amendment. Not to say that we did not have a goal of seeking compensation for our client, but one of the goals was the legal goal. And the litigation turned out quite successful on its own terms. We survived motions with respect to the First Amendment and ultimately went to an evidentiary hearing in which our client testified, her husband testified, various people in addition testified. And the court awarded a $14 million judgment, which included a $10 million punitive award, which is the maximum allowable under Montana law. The question, I guess, is what are the consequences? What are the benefits of litigation of and beyond kind of the advocacy? And this is a kind of a pitch for litigation in general, which is that oftentimes the benefits accrue from the filing of the case through the discovery process, through motion practice, all the way to judgment. The question isn't just what is the judgment and what can you do with that? It's what can you do at every stage? Because unlike a criminal prosecution, the civil lawyers get to speak all the time about what's going on. They get to use what's being developed in the discovery record and make their points. They can go on television, they can go on the radio, they can write op-eds. Moreover, the subpoena power allows you in a presumed public way to put people under oath. And that's transformative, oftentimes both of them, because they never thought they'd have to do this, but the things you learn can inform the broader efforts around the issue. In our case, we did also get a large judgment. We don't think that we're going to receive $14 million from Andrew Anglin, but he has said he'll never come back to the United States. He has had a difficult time finding someone to host his website. And we are working in coordination with others, including Muslim advocates, to find ways to try to end his for-profit hate business. That might include seizing other forms of property in addition to money, such as intellectual property. There are ways to go after the things that he has populated the web with that perhaps can be removed. So I would just kind of give a shout out to litigation as a way really to unearth stuff that can be useful to your colleagues at other organizations, to the movement, to law enforcement that are separate and apart from what we think of as the judgment and the ultimate result of the litigation.
Thank you. I know we need to move on to Seema, but I just want to quickly ask you, do you think those kind of judgments deter other online purveyors of hate?
I don't have firsthand evidence, but I can't imagine that the next person who's thinking of launching a troll storm doesn't think of what happened to Andrew Anglin, what happened in the Muslim Advocates case, and the case brought by one of our future speakers here as well.
Yeah.
So I think it does. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Seema, you oversee the first restorative justice program that's housed in a prosecutor's office. Can you just briefly explain how that works, and in particular, if hate crimes are a part of the scope of the program?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. I work at the DC Office of the Attorney General under Attorney General Carl Racine, and as you mentioned, we're a prosecutor's office. We handle all juvenile prosecution for the District of Columbia and a segment of adult prosecution. And when law enforcement brings a case to our office, we have on staff restorative justice facilitators who can speak to the person who's been harmed, the victim of the offense, the person who's charged with the offense, and offer them and their family and their supporters the restorative justice option. And restorative justice is basically a facilitated conversation with all of the parties that have been impacted by a crime. And what it does is it, in particular, offers victims of crime an opportunity to be heard about how they were impacted and how they were hurt. They have an opportunity to ask questions. As David mentioned, a lot of people who've been harmed have a lot of questions, are curious about why and why they were targeted and what happened before and what the person was thinking and how dare they. And those questions are typically not able to be answered in the traditional justice system. Victims also have a chance to see for themselves if the person who hurt them is truly remorseful and sorry for what they've done. And they have a chance to say in what the person who hurt them needs to do to resolve the matter. And interestingly, these things that victims of crime receive through the restorative justice process track very closely with what trauma research shows people who've experienced trauma need in order to heal from trauma and to move forward. And that's, I guess, not surprisingly why people who go through restorative justice, the victims of crime who've been through the restorative justice process, have exceptionally high rates of satisfaction with the process compared to those who go through the traditional process. of justice systems. Restorative justice also offers for the person who's caused the crime, who's responsible for the harm, a chance to take responsibility directly to the person or people that they've hurt. That kind of accountability doesn't exist in the justice system. They also have the chance to hear directly from the victims, from the people who've been harmed, about how badly they were hurt. And this research shows helps build empathy and understanding, consequential thinking, and a body of research shows recidivism reductions in the people who commit the crime. And this also, restorative justice also offers them a chance to do things, to make the situation right to the extent possible. And that is in many ways a path to redemption. And taking responsibility, being able to show remorse, being able to do things to try and make it right, these are all in many ways preconditions to changing behavior. And in this way, restorative justice is an opportunity to have the people who commit crime, including hate crime, change their behavior, which is ultimately what we want. At our office, we offer restorative justice to victims of serious violent crime, excluding homicides and domestic violence, intimate partner crimes. We do handle hate crimes. Typically, we are handling cases of young people or juveniles who are charged with crime. And we've seen several hate crimes come through our office, crimes of bias that result in violence towards people because of their sexual orientation, because of their race or ethnicity. One case that comes to mind is of an attack on a trans woman on the metro. And in that case, the woman was taunted, spit on, and then physically attacked. And we offered restorative justice to both her and also the young person who was charged with that crime, and both agreed to participate in restorative justice. And we had a restorative justice conference, and the woman who was hurt was really, really angry. She wanted a chance to tell this young person and his family how bad she was hurt. She wanted to tell them what it meant to be trans, what her life was like. And the conference, the Restorative Justice Dialogue, which we call a conference, was a really emotional one, like almost all of them that we hold. And we've held almost 200 restorative justice conferences. And one thing that was really interesting about this particular conference, which we see sometimes, is that this woman got to talk about the struggle that she had been through, both, the fear that she experienced every day, the struggle of being trans in this country, and she got out a lot of strong feelings. And similarly, the young person who committed this crime was able to speak about his life and his struggle, and ended up talking deeply about his experience in the child welfare system, his feelings of not being able to trust anyone and fighting through his life. And what happened, which was beautiful and powerful, was that over time throughout the conference, this dialogue, the woman who was attacked counseled him on how to get over struggle and mistrust and be strong and advocate for the right things. And one of our prosecutors once told me, after observing a restorative justice conference, that she was really impressed by the fact that she saw that the victim of the crime, who she assumed would want something, wanted actually something else. And that was made evident during the conversation that person had had with the people who had hurt him. And in this case, with this woman, we saw the same thing. You see that it's actually quite empowering to a person who's been hurt, not only to have the agency to speak up to the person who hurt them, but also to show generosity and compassion. And in this particular case, what was beautiful was that the two individuals directly impacted, the victim and the child, spent time talking together and kept in touch and helped each other moving forward in different ways. And so restorative justice is this opportunity to use connection and empathy to change behavior, and ideally to stop this kind of violence from happening again. And that's what's really powerful about it.
What are you finding in terms of results, like any effect on recidivism or anything other metric, something concrete?
Sure. We handle all sorts of crime. In particular, right now we're handling serious violent crime, but we've been tracking recidivism at our office. We track victim satisfaction. We did some internal analysis that showed a reduction in recidivism, but we're now doing a more rigorous, we've launched this January, launched a randomized control trial to track recidivism and analyze that data along with a very robust qualitative analysis of the use. But there is a body of research from around the world and around the country about restorative justice that shows reductions in recidivism. And one really interesting thing is the most kind of rigorous research out there, a set of 12 randomized controlled trials that were done in the UK and in Australia. What they find is that restorative justice, in terms of recidivism reduction alone, it is actually far better in terms of reducing recidivism when used on serious violent crime as opposed to low-level crime. There's an increase in recidivism reduction. And interestingly, counter to what I think many people think, restorative justice has a more profound recidivism reduction impact with adults than with juveniles. There's also research that shows for victims of crime that symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome reduce using restorative justice.
I'm curious about what effect you may have seen on prosecutorial culture. You have this great quote I've heard you say, prosecutors look around and they only see risk. They don't get to see hope and compassion. But since you've been in this office since 2016, have you seen any shift in prosecutorial culture as a part of the RJ program?
Yeah, that's thank you for asking that question. We really have. We have prosecutors in our office who, our prosecutors talk to victims differently about what victims need and want from the justice system. I mean, without having restorative justice as an option, prosecutors really have basically two options to offer victims, like prosecute or not prosecute. And with restorative justice, prosecutors can have more nuanced conversations with victims of crime. They some of the prosecutors tell me that they ask victims, what does justice look like for you? What do you need? What would make you feel better and be able to move forward with less fear? And these kind of things were questions that would have been hollow before having restorative justice as an option. What we do is we allow one by one prosecutors, with the consent of all of the parties involved, to sit in and observe a restorative justice conference, which for me, running this program was a terrifying thing to do. But at some point I took a deep breath, and my colleagues encouraged me to do this, and we invited prosecutors to sit in. And what we found was that when a prosecutor sits in on a restorative justice conference, after that, they send more cases and more serious cases to restorative justice. And I think that's because they see in many ways how our existing justice system can't answer some of our most difficult problems. A speaker earlier talked about the fact that when you have mixed motives, where there's like a gray or nuance in the culpability of a situation, that prosecution, at least on hate crimes at the federal level, was difficult and therefore impossible. It had to be handled by the state. And I think that's just one example of how our justice system can't really deal with nuance, where there is culpability at some level on both sides, where there's conflict between people who know each other, who may, you can prosecute one side fully and you'll never address the underlying conflict that much, might lead to future violence and fear bubbling up. The justice system can't deal with that, but restorative justice can. And I think our prosecutors, when they observe restorative justice and they see the outcomes for victims, they see that, and they see how inadequate our justice system in many ways is to deal with the realities of crime and conflict.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to ask each of you now a question that will help us end on a forward-looking note. Sumayyah, what signs of hope do you see in the fight against hate, and what one hate-related issue do you see as most ripe for change right now?
I think there are a lot of signs of hope. I think the fact that young people are just standing up and actually across the board, for American Muslims at least, we've seen a rise in folks, running for office and getting politically engaged. And these are the kinds of responses that, help us both engage with communities more across, different, across difference, and then also allow us to build our power within our communities and have more of a voice. So that's great to see. And then I think young people, every generation stands up and doesn't accept what the previous generations accepted. And I think for our communities and everyone in the fight against hate, I think that's extremely important and gives me hope. And I missed the second part of your question.
Just
what's right for change?
What aspect of our confronting hate work do you see as most right for change? And I'd also love for you to comment on just the work of coalition building as such an emerging practice. Muslim Advocates is such a leader in using the power of coalition, that as well.
Yeah, so right for change is actually one huge area is the online hate, and I think David spoke to this. It's where a lot of hate is proliferating. We're seeing articles daily about Facebook and other social media companies profiting off of hate rather than really confronting it. And so I think that's a very immediate need, and the evidence is just mounting of how much we need to take action. So that I think is one of the most important aspects to get both lawmakers and individual companies taking action. And then in terms of coalitions, yes, we work in coalitions partly because the American Muslim community is so diverse in and of itself that we have to build coalitions within our community. That anti-Muslim hate affects people who aren't Muslim because Muslims have been racialized to be, basically brown and quote unquote foreign and other. And so we've worked a lot with, for instance, the Sikh community who has been hit with anti-Muslim bias as well. And then sometimes we often have the same enemies. So with when David was speaking about the Daily Stormer, he alluded to Muslim Advocates having also filed a lawsuit against them. And we did because they targeted a Muslim comedian named Dean Obeidallah. They falsely accused him of being a terrorist, including doctoring evidence. And so we sued and won a $4 million judgment. And that's just one example of how we often have the same enemies and the need for a coalition building.
Thank you very much. All right, Seema, what motivates you to continue your work? And then my second question, I'll go ahead and just tee it up, is what is the next frontier for restorative justice? Can the principles of restorative justice be integrated into our other alternatives to prosecution?
I'll start with that one. I do believe that restorative justice is an ancient indigenous practice that is in many ways very simple. The idea is to bring the people who are impacted by a harm together to address what happened, how everyone was impacted, and what needs to happen to make things right. While I think some principles within that rubric can be applied to litigation, I do believe that our adversarial system is one that is not well suited for getting at the nuance and long-term public safety that we think that we are getting with it. And so in that way, I think it's really important to be open to questioning the adversarial system and its primacy when addressing conflict and crime. I also think that our existing justice system, with its roots in state violence and systemic racism, can't address some of the most fundamental and vexing problems that we see, including racial disparities, the dehumanization of communities of color who are charged with crime and victims of crime, the silencing of victims, and ultimately behavior change and ensuring public safety. And especially post the murder of George Floyd, I think there's been like a real recognition in mainstream communities about the fact that this justice system is and has racist roots and has real problems with racial disparities. And there aren't very many good answers, but I believe restorative justice is one of them. It is a response to crime and conflict that centers communities that have been impacted. It centers dignity and redemption. And these are important ways to try and both get at the things that we are seeking, public safety, and also to undermine some of the systemic racism that exists in our justice system. And so I think it's actually quite hopeful that there is a real conversation about restorative justice, both for hate crimes, but for criminal justice in general, including transformative justice. And so I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you. All right, David, you are going to get to have the last word. What do you see as being on the horizon for civil litigation, and also what signs of hope do you see? Oh, but you're muted. Yep, there we go.
Thank you to my co-panelists also. I think this has been a terrific conversation. I'm going to talk about a particular feature of the world as it exists right now, which is that I think we're at a moment with respect to our relationship to technology and things that happen online, in which we are recognizing that the previous distinction that we all thought was real between what happened online and what happened in real life is a false one. And that actually gives me hope, specifically because of the work I've done. And what I want to say is that we used to think that things that happened online could be avoided, that they were silly, that online was just for things like filters that put rabbit ears on our face. But I think that there are a lot of forces that are combining right now, including, for example, what was previously mentioned, the series that was published by the Wall Street Journal about Facebook called The Facebook Files, which is changing our perception of what the harms are that can be effectuated by virtue of our interrelationships with various forms of technology. And my hope is that we will begin through that, learning to be a little more responsible towards one another, that this awakening, which is, I think, nearly universal, can be taken as a launching point for something maybe even bigger. And I'm thinking about, for example, the kinds of values that were just described as being intrinsic to restorative justice that the adversarial system might not necessarily highlight. Some of those are things like respect, understanding that your actions have consequences, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And as we wake up to the fact that our technologies can have harms to us that relate to democracy, that relate to our commitment to pluralism, that can relate to our mental health, that can relate to our ability to experience and act in accordance with empathy, that this is a time to talk about all of those values, not just with respect to whether we log on to Facebook or not, but as we participate in a society that has people whose experiences, views, and temperaments are different than ours. So I am hopeful that something that I am particularly focused on has a broader applicability and specifically to making the world more civil.
David, Seema, Sumayyah, thank you all for being on our panel today. And it just, you inspire me, you inspire us all. I wish we had more time together, but you've just, each of us given us thoughts to motivate and keep us moving on in our work in this area. So with that, Louis, I will turn it back over to you. Thank you all again.
Thank you.